Hello, my friends, and welcome to the channel. I am Nicole, and I live in India. And today I am going to be watching the perspective given by geopolitical analyst Abhijit Chavda. And this is, Will America help India in a war with China? I don't know if we would. Let's see what he has to say. If you like the content, please give me a like. Please give me a subscribe. Let me know that you're here. It is the easiest way to support my channel, and I definitely appreciate it. Like, subscribe, let's go.
Imagine there's a hypothetical future war between India and China. And imagine that India finds itself in a situation where it has to ask the US for help. The question is, will the US be willing to help India? And the answer is yes, the US will be happy to help India, but this help will come with strings attached. The US will demand that India agree to a number of conditions in exchange, in return for this help. So what could these conditions
Sounds about
be?
right.
Please subscribe and let's find out what they could be. This video is brought to you by my geopolitics course, Geopolitics from First Principles. The link is in the description below. So first of all, why would India and China go to war hypothetically in the future? Well, that war would be initiated by China. China is the aggressor in the India-China relationship. India does not claim any Chinese territory. India does not threaten China. It's China that claims Indian territory. It's China that has been, for the longest time, threatening India consistently. So if a war does break out, it will be initiated by China. So let's say there's a war. And in what situation, in what scenario would India have to go to the US and ask for help?
This is interesting.
In this hypothetical future war,
what would it be?
Such a scenario would happen if India was in danger of losing significant amount of territories and India's very existence, India's very sovereignty were threatened. Only in such a condition would India go and ask the US for help. So it's mainly about territorial loss, significant territorial loss. And the Chinese, typically, if they go to war with India, they would seek to capture the whole of Arunachal Pradesh. They would seek to capture definitely Tawang. Tawang is very much on the agenda. And they would seek to capture other Indian territories further westwards.
Yeah.
So that would be the Chinese objective. And India would have to go to the US if significant amounts of territory were in danger of being captured by the Chinese. I'm
not quite sure that would ever happen.
So let's say India goes to the US and the US agrees to help India, but gives a list of conditions.
Of course there would be.
What could these conditions be like? Well, first of all, the US will want US military bases in India along the northern border with Tibet. A number of US military bases. They would want full access and control of a number of Indian military bases in this region. They would need Air Force bases as well, airstrips, landing strips, all that. And they would also demand access to certain naval bases, ports. And eventually they would want, once the war is over, that this presence in India, US military presence in India, becomes permanent and troops and equipment are permanently stationed in India. So that would be the condition they would give to India.
For sure.
India has to agree to these conditions for US help. But that's just the first condition. No. What's next? Well, next, the US will demand that India participate in American sanctions against Russia. You're surprised? Of course they would ask for that.
Yeah.
So India should participate in US sanctions against Russia.
Sure.
India should stop buying Russian oil. India should stop buying Russian weapons and arms.
No autonomy. No,
India
do whatever we say.
Must allow the US to inspect the Russian weapons it has in its arsenal so that the Americans can understand the Russian technological capabilities. If India still had INS Chakra, the Akula class submarine, nuclear attack submarine, the Americans would have demanded access to that as well. But that's no longer with India. It's been returned to Russia. So that's about Russia. These would be the demands vis-a-vis India and Russia. Then they will demand that they would demand complete access to India's nuclear program. They will demand complete access to India's missile program. And they will lay down the condition that there should be no further
Exploration or
development
innovation,
of
yeah,
nuclear weapons.
development.
The Indian
Exactly.
nuclear weapons
Sounds
program
exactly
needs to
what
be
we would do.
frozen.
Yep.
That will be their demand, a key demand. And then they will say that since we are asking you to freeze and essentially dismantle your nuclear program and your ballistic missile program, so in return for that, we will station our nuclear weapons with
Yeah.
our
We'll
missiles
have our
on
stuff
your
here.
territory. So they will essentially offer India the same deal they have offered
Offer.
Japan.
Mhm.
The benefit of the protection of the US nuclear umbrella. And Japan also benefits from this. And then the US will demand that India becomes an official, a formal US military ally so
Mhm.
that it can benefit from US protection, just like Japan does, just like Australia does, and so on. So India will have to become formally a US military ally, which comes with a whole host of
Slew
conditions.
of
There's a lot of fine
conditions.
print in that treaty. That's what
Of
India
course
will
there
have
would
to
be.
agree to. Then they will talk about the Indian economy. They will
Mhm.
demand that India opens up its economy and its market to the US, to US companies. They will want unimpeded access to the Indian market. There
No
should
more
be no more
GST, no
trade
more.
and tariff barriers, which is kind of a
Yep.
sore point between the two nations right now. They will require that entirely US owned companies be allowed to open up in India. Right
Mhm.
now, there are rules.
Yeah. Have to be
If a
part
foreign
Indian.
company wants to set up base in India, they need to have a joint venture with a
Yep.
local entity, and there's a cap on what percentage of the new company the foreign
Can be
entity
owned
can
by a
own.
foreign
So
entity.
that will
Yep.
have to be scrapped, and India will have to allow entirely US owned companies to set up base in India. Then they will want the Indian market, the Indian economy to be consumption based, not production based. And India should export services instead
Mhm.
of goods and products
Instead
that
of
are
goods, because the
manufactured.
goods is
And
from
if
US.
India does manufacture goods and products, then those need to be
Cheaper
manufactured for
for
the
US.
benefit of the US and
Yes.
Western market. And the manufacturing should be done by US companies,
Of course it
US
should
owned
be.
companies based in
Yeah.
India, and the profits should be allowed to go back to the
To the
US.
US.
So that's about the economy. What next? Well, next, they will require that India should normalize relations with Pakistan and offer
Oh,
certain concessions to Pakistan.
that's
For
interesting.
example, reimpose Article 370 in Kashmir, a small concession just to make
Small.
Pakistan feel good and make it feel like, yes, now we can talk to India and normalize relations. So that will be a key demand of the US to
This is
normalize relations with
interesting.
Pakistan and reimpose, let's say, Article 370 in Kashmir. Next, they will say, roll back the FCRA curbs. FCRA means Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. So that's an act of the Indian government by which companies that are that register for this, that are registered for FCRA and who have FCRA licenses, they can receive money from abroad, from other countries. So typically it's NGOs that receive money from abroad. Typically it's think tanks that receive money from abroad and so on and
Yeah.
so forth. So you have to be FCRA registered. You need to have an FCRA registration or license. So of late, the Indian government has been clamping down and cancelling the FCRA registrations of a number of NGOs and think tanks and all that. So typically these NGOs, they serve foreign interests. They're
Yeah.
typically, let's say, religious NGOs that conduct large scale religious conversions in India, conversions to foreign religions. There are think tanks that further the agenda and the national interest of foreign powers at the expense of India, and so on. So India has been clamping down on this. India has been cancelling the FCRA registrations of a number of these entities, NGOs, think tanks, and all that. So the US will say, roll back all of these FCRA curbs, allow everybody to receive money from foreign countries, essentially the US.
Yeah.
Next, the US will require the right, they will demand the right to conduct unimpeded subnational diplomacy in India. So, what is subnational diplomacy? Subnational diplomacy is when US officials, typically diplomatic officials from the embassies, from the embassy and consulates, etc., they engage with local politicians in various Indian states one to one. So it's all about essentially about interfering in the internal affairs of India, and they
Hmm.
typically engage with
That sounds like
politicians and
something we would
political
want to do.
parties that are typically opposed to the central government. And it is also alleged that the US may have allegedly funded and created entirely new political parties in India. So they will want the right to do more of this.
Of course. Of
Unimpeded,
course we would.
unobstructed access and right to indulge in such activities. That's what will be demanded. Next, they will
Continued.
require that India allow US experts to sit as advisors for the
Company
Indian
boards.
education system. So
Oh,
obviously the Indian education system is very flawed, it's very backward, it's very
I wonder
primitive
why they would do
compared to
that.
the US. So the US will offer India the benefit of its experts to reform the education system. So they will want to
But why?
correct the
What
curriculum,
what
let's
would
say,
what would the
in
U.S. get out of that?
in subjects like history and so on. They will want to promote the superior American values. Uh, Essentially, it means promoting uh, what's called
What?
woke ideology and all that. So they will want that to happen. So they will demand the right. They
They
will
don't
demand
promote woke
access
ideology
to the
here.
Indian
I
education
think I
system. They will
kind of
want their
disagree with
experts to
this.
be taken as advisors, policy advisors, curriculum advisors, and
I
so
don't know
on.
if they would do that.
And all of these demands, they will require that India sign a formal treaty agreeing to all of these terms. India will
Yeah.
have to officially and formally sign a treaty with the US, agreeing to all of these terms. And the text of the treaty will not be made public, but the
No,
treaty will
we
be
wouldn't.
binding
Yeah.
because India has officially signed it. And the US military presence that will happen in India in such a hypothetical scenario, this US military presence will enforce this treaty. So after a few months, after the war is over, if India feels like, okay, now we don't want to do it, that won't be allowed. The US
No, of
military presence will ensure that the treaty is enforced.
course it would.
All right. So now do you understand why India is a genuinely sovereign nation today?
Yes.
Because India does not have to do any of that. No nation can demand all of these terms and conditions of India. That's why India is a genuinely sovereign nation. Take a look at the Chavda Index of Hard Power, which is going to be released soon. This is the top 20, the top 20 nations in the world. If you look closer, you will see that only 4 of these nations, the top 4, are fully sovereign nations. Their sovereignty risk is low and their sovereignty score is above 1. Out of more than 190 nations in the world, only 4 nations are fully sovereign. It's the US, it's Russia, it's China, and India. And all the other nations have a sovereignty score of less than 1. How did I calculate this? Well, if you want
How
to
did you?
understand, check out my course. The link is in the description below.
No, of
So
course.
that's what it means to be a sovereign nation. And in case India suffers a setback in a future hypothetical war with China, India could end up losing its sovereignty if it has to go to the US and ask for help. Such help will be given in exchange for almost complete loss of sovereignty. So India will be forced to hand over its destiny to the US. For example, like the UK, like Australia, like all the NATO members, all the members of NATO, like Japan, like South Korea. Each of these cases is slightly different. Japan is under complete US occupation
Yeah.
and so on. But there you have it. So, in case such a scenario does play out, then India will, in exchange for US help, have to hand over its sovereignty to the US and hand over its destiny to the US. And let's say India does hypothetically agree to such terms in a hypothetical future war. Then what does the US do after India signs on the dotted line? Well, in the US will obviously first of all send their troops, their aircraft, their naval ships, warships, and all that to the bases that they want to occupy in India. And then they will conduct, after a while, some diplomacy with China. First, they will allow China to grab some territory, a reasonably large amount of territory. Then they will, once all the troops and aircraft and all that are in place and nuclear weapons are in place, they will conduct diplomacy with China. Tell the Chinese, okay, now this is the red line. We are here now. India is now under our protection. You need to back off. And the Chinese will back off because they will have gained some territory and they will essentially have gotten what they want, perhaps. But maybe the Chinese also may not have calculated that such a big new risk will appear almost at their doorstep. So it could end up doing more harm than good to China. But for India, the harm will be in such a hypothetical scenario,
Sovereignty.
fictitious scenario, the harm for India will be incalculable. So that is a completely fictitious hypothetical future scenario. If India has to go to the US for help, this is what will happen. And it's not some imaginary scenario that I'm cooking up for you. This has happened throughout history. Welcome to the real world. This is how the world works. Take a look at how the British Empire expanded in India after it captured a toehold in West Bengal. Through these means, one of the straightforward examples is Manipur. In the early 19th century, Manipur was conquered and occupied by the Burmese Empire, and the king of Manipur had to go to the British to ask for help and protection. The British were very happy to come to
Of
his
course, I'll help
aid,
you.
to the aid of
Mhm.
Manipur, and offer their protection to Manipur. And they installed a political agent in the court in Manipur, in Imphal, and they also signed a treaty with the Burmese. And this entry of the British into this matter was the beginning of the downfall of not just the kingdom of Manipur, but also the kingdom of Burma.
Mhm.
Both were annexed, occupied, and essentially destroyed, and they are both still suffering
Yeah,
from the lingering effects, horrible lingering effects of British rule.
yeah,
So that is what can happen. That is kind of the worst case scenario. So India has to ensure that such a scenario never comes to pass.
for sure.
India, I have already laid out 5 things India needs to do to ensure that China behaves and ensure that there is no war between India and China. One of the things is a nuclear deterrent, and we have a very good nuclear deterrent in India. Yeah, I'll not go into the details of that, but India needs to do more. We always need to do more. So remember this: India has no friends, India has no military allies, India is entirely on its own, and that is what it means to be a sovereign, non imperialist nation. You are entirely on your own. But that's how it should be if you want to be a sovereign nation. So that's the situation. Get used to it. And yeah, that's about it. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.
Well, that was an interesting perspective from Abhijit Chavda. I would say that I do agree with most of his assessment, apart from the education um, uh, idea there that he said that we would come to reevaluate or institute different ideals in the education system. I'm not sure if the U.S. would do that. I think maybe that had been something that had been done over 100 years ago or around that time when we were doing that, trying to make certain that people were more Western. But I'm just not sure if that would be the case anymore because India has such a ingrained culture. I don't think it would even be worth it for the U.S. to try. Like it just wouldn't even try. Anyway, so I'm not sure if I agree with that point. The other points I definitely see as to why the U.S. would do that, and I I would agree that they probably would. I do have to say that this is obviously, as he said, a very fictitious scenario. Do I ever think that India would call on the U.S. to require support against, China with a war on China? I don't think India would ever let it get to that place. I don't think India would ever require support. And I don't, he said that India doesn't have any friends. Again, I'm not really sure I agree on that either. India has friends. And just having friends and, using your friends, I think are two different things. Like you can have friends and not use them and still maintain your sovereignty. It's okay to be friendly. And it's okay to do that. I think India is, for the most part, very friendly. I mean, they're neutral and friendly, and they're open to relations with most countries. So I think that it's a good thing. And would they ever require more from their friends? I just don't think so. But it's good to have friends. So that was my reaction. If you like the reaction, please give me a like. Please give me a subscribe. If you have something that you would like me to watch and react to, please put it in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. As always, I love you and bye-bye.